Yeah, I mean, I had a question about Vance, but I think we'll come back to him in future episodes since we've moved on to the assassination itself. And it's almost a question then to Tom, and then coming back to Emily, which is that um, one of the things that as I read and pay attention to American politics is simply how much it's a matter of just a few 3 or 4% of votes here and there that switch, and how entrenched a lot of the vote is. Tom, would it have surprised you if an assassination attempt on a major figure in British politics would not have significantly shifted the contours of a race?
It's a really interesting question, and we have seen serious political violence in this country in recent years, but never directed at a very, very senior figure. So, it would be very difficult to speculate about what the impact of that would be if a party leader was targeted in that way. It would clearly it would transform the national debate in all sorts of ways. But I think a lot would depend on who it was, what the motivation was. The debate would go in lots of different ways, and I'm very nervous about. I think there's a specificity to the question that's very hard to get into. But you're right that our recent election was not particularly close, and so the dynamics of that may be different. But we saw a Labour MP, Joe Cox, murdered by a far right extremist just before the EU referendum in 2016. We saw a Conservative MP, David Amess, murdered by an Islamist extremist in his constituency 2 or 3 years ago. Another Labour MP who is now a minister was stabbed and very seriously injured by someone in his office a few years ago. Made a full recovery, but that was a very nasty incident. These things do happen, and they have tended not to lead to any sort of particularly party political response, so much as different kinds of response about civility in politics, about the safety of MPs, about whether more protective measures are needed, about whether as a career it's a safe thing to do, all of which are quite important questions, but they tend not to go to, no one goes to, or no one serious goes to, this shows that this party can't be trusted with security, or no one goes to, these people were right, or it would have been better if this had happened. These things don't happen at all. There were quite a few examples in the most recent election campaign of MPs being intimidated in their constituencies, and that was particularly characterised actually by seats where the main challengers were the various independent candidates who were campaigning around Gaza. And it's not necessarily the candidates themselves, but a lot of the Labour candidates who were targeted spoke about campaigners having their tyres slashed, people being intimidated. Jess Phillips, who's Labour MP, had her speech at her count interrupted by people chanting, and that is very different from the sort of political violence that we're talking about here. But it's on a continuum of just people making it harder to conduct politics in the normal way, and so it's perceived as part of that debate. But yeah, what we haven't seen in this country is anything at a in living memory, at least. Well, that's not quite true, because the IRA, of course, did attempt to bomb Downing Street with Prime Minister John Major in it, not that long ago. But since then, I don't think there's been anything at a sort of at the top level of UK politics. But how it would change things if that did happen, it's very hard to predict, I think.
Yeah, I think the sort of the fact that it should change everything and didn't here speaks to three things. The first is just how common gun violence in America is and how common shootings are in this country. The second is how much, just like what a roller coaster every day in American politics has been for the past several years, right? Like that truly wild happenings are occurring all the time. And relatedly, I really think people are burned out on the news. Like they don't want to follow it anymore. He's alive, great, we can keep moving. Is I think the thought process in that many people have. We know this is going to be a very low turnout, or we think this will probably be a very low turnout election. We think that most people are checked out, and that's reflected in the reaction to this event.
Yeah. I sort of want to ask Rohan about the extent of political violence in India and how that has affected elections, because obviously there has been a history of very senior Indian politicians being killed, which has clearly, well, has had a direct impact on elections because certain candidates have not been able to take part. How much is that part of sort of public awareness and public discourse about elections in India? Do people take political violence seriously as one of the themes of what elections are about?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. It was partly why I posed the previous question to you, which is that in India the assumption would be that something like this engenders a sympathy wave. It could potentially quite change an election, and the reason to believe that is because we've seen it in the past. Particularly in a couple of instances of successful assassination attempts. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her bodyguards in '84, and the subsequent election saw the Congress win the most seats it ever had, and it was really seen as a sympathy wave for Indira. Her son Rajiv Gandhi, as a candidate in 1991, was also assassinated by a suicide bomber from the Tamil Tigers, the Sri Lankan separatist militant group. And that also led a smaller sympathy wave, although the Congress wasn't, which also was elected, but because it didn't have a Gandhi at the helm, it seemed to not have enough for a majority then. But it sort of creates this template of sympathy being the response, broadly speaking, to assassination attempts. The question about political violence, and both of those are quite in the past, right? That's the early '90s, and then before that in the '80s. Political violence in India, although some feel it's become more obvious or prevalent in the last few years, actual data suggests that it's been going down, both at the ballot box where people have to go and vote, and in terms of actual assassinations of candidates. Now, of course, at the lower levels of Indian politics, there's a lot of money, often illicit money, and plenty of sort of gang involvement in Indian politics, which engenders and a high level of criminality, that is, people who have criminal records who contest elections. And so that means there is still a certain level of, including tit-for-tat assassinations and things like that. But it's gone down tremendously in the last few years. And there's definitely a sense that India ought to have emerged from some of those, particularly in conjunction with violence in parts of the country. So when you had bigger insurgencies in Punjab, even more complex situation in Kashmir and in other parts of the country, there was more violence at the political level, including, as we mentioned, in connection with Sri Lanka. So it's definitely gone down, but it's not something that, and it's unlikely to happen. There was a bombing of a rally of Prime Minister Modi's a few years ago, although he was not personally in danger. And nobody died, if I remember correctly, from that. But it's not something that is beyond the pale. In recent and living memory for many people, Indian politicians have faced this.